So we're looking at SQL syntax type or SQL syntax types today. If you notice on there, I've got DXL in my subheading or my subtitle for this. The reason for the DXL, X as a variable is the standard abbreviation we see in Mathland, but not in our class. But the idea that there are different different letters that will fit inside the type or syntax of languages that we use with databases. Data X language. The idea behind this is that there are different types of languages that we use inside SQL or SQL. And they're organized by the actions that they can perform or use. And the different X's are either M for manipulate, D for design, or C for control. And the language types themselves, they're not actually full languages because they're interoperable. You can't just use only one or only the other, but they depend on each other. But the idea behind it is that they actually are different subsets of the idea of how to use a database and program and access databases with them. There are specific keywords that belong to each, quote, language attached to this. And so we'll be looking at those individual keywords later. But what we're doing right now is looking at just the idea and concept of the data languages. So we have DDL, DML, and DCL are the three different DXLs in SQL programming. The first one we're going to look at is DCL, or the data control language. This is how we get access to the data. Specifically, this is what allows individual users of the database or groups of users or types of users the ability to insert, create, delete, modify, rollback, etc. All those different commands and keywords you have in a database, all those depend on your user access level. This is controlled by the DCL part of the languages, and there are a couple of different keywords that go along with it. Basically, the two main ones, though, are grant and revoke. Grant gives you, revoke takes away. And these, there are a couple other keywords that are based on that, with, like I said, the idea of a role or individual users that we can attach to that. But the DCL languages are necessary for any other language statement to happen. If you have a low DCL level status, then you can't do stuff. So you have to actually have that grant of level before you can execute any of the other statements or types of languages on your database. You can also adjust those language types. So say, for example, you are set as a this level user. Depending on your DCL level that's granted to you, whatever permissions you have assigned to you, you can assign those permissions to other users at your level or below. Theoretically, and this is where some database hacking occurs, is that you have level X. However, they have not disabled your ability to grant a new user a different level, where you could create a brand new user with full access to the entire database. And a poorly designed database would allow that. In fact, unfortunately, many databases do not have that turned off by default. So I only have this user login, but when I can go and log in and create a user, even though I have this low level, I can create a user with full access. And by not securing your database, by not having that identified as to what those correct grant and revoke permissions are assigned to individuals, that is where we see a lot of database hacking come into play. And so the DCL is very important. We actually need to make sure we look at that early on so we can avoid screwing up things later. And like I said, it defines access for the manipulation and the definition structures of how you actually create or use those database values inside there. Our next one we're looking at is the DDL. And again, we're organizing this based on the level of access you need to do things. You have to have your DCL set so you can actually do stuff. The DDL is the creation or the definition language. This is how we actually build the structure of our database. It's creating a database itself, creating tables inside the database, deleting tables inside the database, and changing the structure of tables. So the DDL statements all are built on the database itself or the framework of the database. This is the structural code. This is not the values inside it. However, there are some DDL statements that will delete data, but they do not create data. It can only delete data if you drop an entire table. That would obviously change the structure of the database by dropping the table. That's gone. But the user access that you have on this, if you have a level to create tables but not delete tables, you can build many, many tables. You could possibly even change a table based on your access. So it could look for permissions of a different table and again, granting you the ability to do things that you're not supposed to do. So that DCL idea, figuring out the permissions and the grant that you have attached to that is very important for setting up your other access points so you can prevent, say, for example, inappropriate users from destroying your database. Because you may have a password on your database as a whole, but once someone gets past that password, they could go through and actually do components even, I've got a password, you can't do it, but And if they get past that password, they can still, even though they're not a user, they could just simply create a user and get into that. So this is something you actually make sure you want to apply and set up properly, so that those permissions that create and delete data are very much identified and spelled out as you design your database. The last one we have is the DML. These are the most common statements or queries that you will use inside the database. These are the ones that we actually use to use the data of the database. The data manipulation, it's either inserting, changing, or removing the data. This is how we use the data. Even viewing it is all through the DML statements. Again, just like we have with the data definition language, it is based on your access level. If you only have view access, you can't remove or add things to that database. And in fact, that is one of the most common levels of access, is to give someone view status so they can see the what's inside the database, but they can't change anything. I will be giving you guys the database here in class with that same structure, where you have access to view the data, but you can't pull a query on that. You can't get anything out of it other than simply looking at it. The structure must exist first, so you have to have your DDL statements executed previous to any DML statements being used. You can't retrieve data from a table if the table's not there. It's worse than no pointer exception. It's just like, huh? I'm clueless. What are you talking about? Because if there's no structure, you can't run a DML statement. So the DML statements are dependent on the DDL. You can create a table without running any DCL statements. You can simply just set up as a super user and make everything. And then make all your tables, delete all your tables, make all your databases, delete your databases, etc. But you cannot run any DML statement without structures already. The structure has to be there first. And so that's something you have to make sure you have in advance. One of the things that's specifically attached to the DML statements is the idea of CRUD. Now, CRUD is an acronym. Create, read, update, delete. Create is obviously inserting new values. Read is selecting those values from the data and actually viewing them. Update is changing. And delete is pretty self-explanatory. The CRUD ability is what most database operations are. You will insert stuff, put stuff out, and look at it a lot. Those CRUD statements are the main ones that you use as a database operator or even as a designer to test out what's going on inside your database. And so keep in mind that the CRUD acronym is not talking about crap or just garbage at the bottom of the barrel. CRUD is looking at the things that you most commonly do with a database. And that is in the DML category of language, where we are creating, inserting, updating, removing, deleting. So those are the basic structures of language. Again, looking over that really fast. We have our DCL, the way we get access to different components of the database. Our DDL, where we define the database itself, its tables and its database structure as a whole, and what the components of that database are, including the fields. And finally, our CRUD statements that belong to DML. DML is how I add and insert, remove, delete, etc. into the actual database itself, the ones that we use most often, but require already a DCL and DML setup before we get in there.